All right. Hi, everybody. We're going to get started with today's webinar. I'm Elisa Oberman. I am the Executive Director at Marine Renewables Canada, and I'm going to be your host and moderator for today's session. First of all, I just want to say that very happy to have all of you here joining us today for our second webinar in this Offshore Wind Series of webinars that we're doing and co-hosting with the Consulate General of Canada in Boston. For today's session, you're going to be hearing from Xodus on the opportunities, some analysis and insights for entering the US offshore wind market. And this is something we're really happy that we've been starting to do more of with the Trade Commissioner Service and others. Marine Renewables Canada is very focused on supporting Canadian companies to work in the offshore wind market internationally. And obviously the US is a very key market that's emerging and has a lot of opportunities. There's a number of different activities that we are also leading, but in the interest of time, I'm not going to get into all of that. But if you're interested in learning more about how we might be able to support your company, please at any time feel like you can reach out to us and hopefully we can help. And so one thing too, I just want to say before we get going, just housekeeping items, we're going to try to answer, or the presenters are going to try to answer as many questions that come through. So I would encourage anyone participating to use the Q&A function, and they will try to answer in real time if they see it, or I will try to go through them at the end. We'll try to get to what we can. So with that, I would like to now introduce Erin Donahue with the Trade Commissioner Service, or she's a Trade Commissioner for Defense and Ocean Technologies with the Consulate General of Canada in Boston, and she's going to provide some remarks and then introduce our presenters for today.
Thank you very much, Elisa, and thank you to Marine Renewables Canada for co-hosting this event. I know many of the folks on the line did join us for the first of our webinar series on the US Jones Act, but as Lisa mentioned, I am a Trade Commissioner responsible for Ocean Tech at the Canadian Consulate in Boston. For those of you who don't know, the Canadian Trade Commissioner Service assists Canadian companies around the world in their international business development opportunities. I've been following the offshore wind sector for the past several years, and things are really starting to heat up. So I'm excited that in this strange time we find ourselves in, where international travel is still a bit tricky, that we're able to do this webinar series to really highlight some of the new things that are happening. So I appreciate all of you joining today. I'm hoping that shortly we'll have some more information about upcoming in-person events and programs that will be taking place in the fall. In the meantime, if any of the companies on the lines have any questions about things that are happening in the US offshore wind market, or if you're looking for introductions or local contacts, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. With that, I would love to introduce the team from Xodus Group. Xodus is an international firm with offices in the UK, Japan, and the US, including Boston and Rhode Island. They work on a variety of supply chain development activities for the offshore wind market, and they assist companies with their market entry strategies into the offshore wind market, which is what they'll be speaking about today. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Jeff Tingley and to Delia Warren to do a little bit more about market entry strategies into offshore wind. Jeff and Delia?
Thank you very much. Ooh, a bit of feedback there. Anybody else hear that? Yes, thank you very much for having us and for hosting us on this forum today. We're absolutely delighted to be speaking about market entry for offshore wind in the United States. Before we start, I'll give a little bit of background on myself. My name is Delia Warren. I'm actually from St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador originally. I have a background in offshore oil and gas. I worked out of St. John's for a number of years, as well as in Europe in that industry. And now I have transitioned into the offshore wind industry, which similar to the supply chains, there's a lot of overlap in the skills required in both those industries as well. I've been with Xodus since March, and it is an extremely exciting time in the United States. I'm working out of the Boston office, and the offshore wind industry is, really taking off. So it's a very exciting time. I'm going to let my colleague Jeff Tingley introduce himself before we get started.
Thank you, Delia, and thanks everyone for joining this afternoon. It's just a treat to be with you all. My name is Jeff Tingley. I'm head of strategy and market development for Xodus, and I've been involved in offshore wind for about 6 years now. I actually helped the Block Island project get built and helped sort of develop a New England supply chain. And so I'm just thrilled to be talking with you all this afternoon and anxious to answer any questions that you might have. So Delia, back over to you to start things off.
Awesome. I'm going to start by sharing our presentation. It's just getting warmed up there. Anyone see that yet?
Yes.
Okay. Oopsie. Here we go. Okay, so as we mentioned, we are here to share a little bit of our experience and insight into the current state of the offshore wind industry in the United States. We're going to talk a little bit about the supply chain, the areas where development is happening, how far along development is in certain regions. Following that, we're going to give a little bit of information on our market entry analysis process. So I'm going to start off the presentation and then I'll be handing it over to Jeff about halfway through. As we said, if you have any questions, pop them in the Q&A, and we have allotted a fair bit of time at the end to respond to specific questions. So first off, Xodus, we are a global consulting company with a specialty in the energy sector. So we work across all different types of energy. We were founded in 2005 and headquartered in Aberdeen, Scotland. We have a team of over 350 specialist consultants. And right now we are really expanding into the renewables sector. We've had a renewables team for a while, and we've really worked a lot in Europe and beyond in providing consultancy and support services for all aspects of the offshore wind industry. So this is not new to us. It might be a new industry in North America, but for our company, you know, we've been around the block already a few times. And like I said, we do operate globally. We're a subsidiary of Subsea 7, and we operate in a number of sectors. So just to give a little bit of an introduction, I know a lot of you are very familiar with the offshore wind industry in the US, but for those of you that aren't, I'll just give a brief overview. So currently all the offshore wind development in the United States is taking place on the East Coast. All the projects that have had contracts signed that are sanctioned to actually go into operation are on the East Coast of the United States. However, there are currently only 2 smaller scale wind farms that are operational. There's the Block Island Wind Farm, which comprises 5 offshore wind turbines, which is offshore Rhode Island. And there's the pilot project, the CVOW project operated by Dominion Energy off the coast of Virginia, which is 2 offshore wind turbines. However, the Vineyard Wind project off of Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts recently received record of decision. That was in May 2021. And that is really going to kickstart the entire industry in the United States. The federal government has recently announced a target of 30 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity by 2030, which is an extremely ambitious goal. But if you look at the graph there on the bottom left of the screen, you can see that many states are already very well positioned to make a real good indent on that goal, or a dent on that goal. So the states of New Jersey and New York and North Carolina currently have the highest capacity targets. New York was in the lead firmly at 9, with New Jersey at 7.5 gigawatts of capacity. And North Carolina made an announcement in June that kind of took us all by surprise by targeting 8 gigawatts of capacity by 2040. Additionally, New Jersey just awarded 2 projects in their waters, which basically transferred about 3.6 gigawatts from being in the planning / unallocated stages to under contract. So we're really seeing things ramp up in the industry. One of the issues we have in our line of work right now is that things are happening so quickly that when we write reports and give presentations, they're basically out of date by the time they're delivered. The announcements are happening so fast. So that's really exciting. And some figures have shown, many studies have indicated that it's estimated that about $80 billion is going to be spent in the US in CapEx alone for these projects by 2030. So there's a lot happening, and a lot of things to be keeping your eye out for. I've got California shown there. They recently announced that they're developing wind energy areas along the West Coast as well, but there's currently no leased areas offshore California, and the same is goes for the Gulf of Mexico. So these are areas to look out for. They are fairly well suited for offshore wind energy. They have a lot of resource potential, but we don't really go into detail about them in this presentation as there's currently no signed contracts for projects. But we can answer some questions on those regions later if you are so interested. So we've basically broken the East Coast down into 3 regions for the purposes of today's presentation to kind of give a snapshot of the status of the industry. So we're going to be looking at New England first, followed by New York, New Jersey. And then after that, we're going to look at the Mid-Atlantic region. So starting up north in New England, this region really has a first mover advantage because Block Island was the first project built here, and the Vineyard Wind 1 project, as I mentioned before, is scheduled to begin construction by 2022. So a lot of exciting things happening. You do see a lot of companies congregating in this region in order to take advantage of those first movers. So in terms of all of these states combined, Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, they have a combined regional target of 10 gigawatts of offshore capacity by 2035. Another really interesting feather in the hat of New England is the fact that the first floating wind project, so all of the projects I've mentioned before along the East Coast are based on fixed bottom foundations for their offshore wind turbines, or the majority, but the first floating project is the New England Aquaventus project off the coast of Maine. And that's going to really lead to a lot of further development in the United States because there are a lot of regions where the water is deep and floating technology is required. So that is, again, they will have first mover advantage in that type of technology. So in this region, the key ports to look out for are New Bedford and Provport in Rhode Island, New Bedford being in Massachusetts. And what we have seen in the European offshore wind industry is that when key ports are developed, when they attract OEMs or original equipment manufacturers or tier 1 supply chain companies, you see a natural clustering occurring of other supply chain players, of supporting businesses, of workforce, that type of thing. So when I say key ports, we are highlighting those as areas where we believe that clustering is going to occur in the future. So I've listed the projects and the associated capacities at the bottom. And the other thing to take away here is that the supporting organizations, so economic development organizations, industry organizations, government training representatives, these are the organizations that really hold the reins for these industries. They know what incentives are available. They have a good idea for the timeline for these projects. And so I've listed them here. I'm not going to go through all of them, but these are organizations that are essential to establish contact with if your company is seeking to enter the US offshore wind industry. Okay, so following along, New York and New Jersey are very key states in terms of capacity targets and current activities in the United States. Combined, they have a regional target of 16.5 gigawatts by 2035, which is the largest project capacity in the current pipeline of US projects. It is a slightly more expensive to do business here. There are very, the cost of workforce is higher. There's a high labor organization presence, that type of thing. But you're seeing a lot of investment and a lot of interest in these states right now. The key ports to look out for in New York and New Jersey are the South Brooklyn Marine Terminal, the Port of Albany, and Windport, although other ports are getting infrastructure upgrades as we speak, specifically as a result of the recent award by New Jersey for the Atlantic Shores and Ocean Wind 2 projects. So this is definitely one of the major regions where activity is taking place, like I said, and they're trying to establish a foothold as in terms of manufacturing in that region as well. So the Mid-Atlantic region is comprised of Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina for the purposes of our analysis. And prior to the announcement of the 8 gigawatt target that North Carolina made recently, the overall capacity targets for this region weren't really as attractive as, in the New York, New Jersey region. However, once the governor of North Carolina signed an executive order stating that 8 gigawatts was their target by 2040, it changed the whole game. And now this region really is a power hitter in terms of offshore wind development in the United States. So like I mentioned, they have the first mover advantage with the CVOW pilot project. But CVOW and Kitty Hawk, those are 2 additional projects that are going to be executed off of Virginia and North Carolina that are very large capacity projects. So they're, both above 2 gigawatts, which given the history of offshore wind globally, they're quite substantial projects, and they'll be, it'll be a technological feat to install them. It'll be quite impressive. So the main ports to look out for in these regions are Hampton Roads in Virginia and Baltimore in Maryland. Both are basically working on developing infrastructure, building networks, specifically the Hampton Roads Alliance in terms of supporting organizations in Virginia has been very proactive in terms of developing the supply chain required for the CVOW project and the projects beyond that. And they've really taken, they've got a really good attitude towards wanting to increase the amount of local content in the region. One other point that's really interesting about the states in the Mid-Atlantic region, specifically Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina, is they've recently signed, last year, they signed an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding, which basically commits them to jointly developing the offshore wind industry through shared supply chain, shared workforce, and shared definition of local content. So one thing that is a very big focus for the entire industry in the United States, obviously, is a focus on local content. So I'll go back to that actually. So as the industry develops, and Jeff is going to speak to this a little bit more in his part of the presentation, but this is a very new industry. It's a nascent industry. It has a very immature supply chain in the United States. So what they're looking to do is really bring in a lot of external expertise in the early years, import a lot of products and services to get the projects in the ground, or in the water, sorry. But in the longer term, they really need to establish a local supply chain, local manufacturing capabilities, local installation capabilities in the United States. So it's really, a game of looking for external support in the early days and then transitioning over time to having all that capability in-house in the country. Another aspect of the United States and of the industry that is critical to consider as an external company is the fact that it may be one country, but it is comprised of 50 different states. Each state has their own legislation, their own ways of doing things, their own political climates, that type of thing. So it's a really big consideration when entering this industry to take all that into consideration. So just to summarize, in terms of geography, what we were discussing in the previous slides about the current state of the industry, these stars basically show where we anticipate supply chain clustering to occur. So these are the places that you really want to look out for. Some of these ports have already had OEMs commit to establishing operations such as nacelle plants or blade plants or that type of thing. And that's going to be something you're going to want to keep an eye on going forward. So there's a real opportunity for Canadian companies, not necessarily because of their expertise in offshore wind in particular, because as everyone here is aware, there are no offshore wind projects in Canada either. But we do have a lot of expertise in heavy industry, in offshore industries. We have a lot of vessel assets. that could be put to use, and just general knowledge and expertise that could be beneficial in growing the offshore wind industry in the United States. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jeff, and he's going to discuss a little bit of the market entry strategy that Xodus employs.
Thank you, Delia. First of all, I think it's really important to sort of look at a timeline here. And really the goal of this slide is we're going to have to, in the US, establish an entirely new industry. I mean, as Delia mentioned, there's about $80 billion in CapEx. We also estimate that there is probably going to be 73,000 jobs that are going to be available to support the 30 gigawatt target. So what you're really seeing happening right now is that the pre-projects, which are the planning stages, we're now moving into projects with Vineyard Wind. Much of that material, et cetera, is going to be shipped from overseas because we don't have a supply chain yet. However, if you look towards 2026 or so, there's going to be as many as 300 turbines per year commissioned. This means that we really have to create a US industry. And the US industry is going to be looking to adjacent industries in order to bring expertise and in order to build out its supply chain. And so there's really the opportunity. There's an opportunity for companies in Canada to become involved now. That early involvement tends to have a real influence in this industry we've seen so far. First movers do have an advantage. And there is also a hunger and a thirst for the expertise. Next slide, Delia, please. So success in the US really boils down to three things. Really, it's creating a network. And we can't stress enough that if there is an interest in being in the offshore industry in the US, you really have to be here. As Delia mentioned earlier, there's announcements almost weekly about major changes, and you need to continually engage with potential customers, potential partners, and the industry as a whole, because what the industry is looking here is finding trusted advisors. Those products and services that are available from multiple sources that can really support and can really grow the industry and support market demands, which really then means a competency. And we need that competency in the US. The experience in Canada in your oil and gas, in your manufacturing, is really very close to a lot of the work that has to take place in offshore wind. So there are great opportunities to bring that experience and bring that knowledge into our market and help be part of growing the US offshore wind market, which is advantageous from a revenue standpoint and from a product standpoint. Delia, next slide, please. Here's really the important thing, though, is that we really believe that the best market entry strategy is one that de-risks entry. And so as you move through a process of deciding to come into the US market, what it's going to look like when you're here, how to operate, et cetera, that there's a certain decision path that has to take place. And this process is really a way to systematically move into a market while de-risking your investment and increasing your chances of success at critical decision points within the market entry process. And so I'm going to go over each of these because I think it's really important to sort of have a framework for which we find that market entry is going to be the most successful in the US. Next slide, Delia. And the first thing is, what is the pathway going to be? There's lots of ways to enter a market. There's organic growth, there's joint ventures, there are acquisitions, there's being acquired. There's a host of different ways of entering the market. So the first thing I think to decide is what is your organization going to look like? Next slide, please. So that really is an alignment of what your company goals are, what your company's strengths are, the products, financial, etc. Looking at the US market and what those same things correspond to in the US market, and finding out where there's linkages between your strategy, the market needs. Next slide. And that really points to what I'm going to call a heat map. And Delia, if you go into the next slide. So what this shows is via the criteria, and we've listed some key decision-making and criteria. They won't apply to everyone, but they will apply to some. It sort of gives a look at what is the best strategy. The dark green being sort of the optimum strategy, the red being things not to look at. And so as you look at your key criteria in growing your business and what your corporate goals are, you look at what the US market demand is and where your strategies fit that demand, you begin to get a sense of what makes the best sense as far as market entry, meaning what kind of organization you want to have. Because there is also the decision that maybe it doesn't make sense to come in right now. It's better that you determine that up front and be clear about why that is true than get here, spend money and time, and not have the success that you want. So really determining the type of operation that best suits your market entry and best suits the market is really the key point in all this. Next slide, please, Delia. So you really support this by qualitative research and determining a value proposition. So the criteria that you have for entry will sort of develop a list of types of things: a joint venture, strategic partner, acquisitions, or whether you set up your own organization and go it alone. The next thing is really to look at, if I'm going to be a joint venture, who are the people that I should really be talking to? Who are the companies that their needs and their business and their personality, if you will, best fit your company's needs, business, and personality? And develop a short list and really spend some time engaging with those people, seeing where the synergies are, seeing where the overlaps are, seeing how a combined organization, seeing how a partnership, seeing how a joint venture it would look, and then report that. So get other opinion within the company, and from that you have a fairly clear path as to what your organization will look like, the people that you want to initially partner with, and that really helps you on your way to success. Next slide, please, Adelia. Once you've decided to enter the market, it's really the most important thing is to conceptualize, and that's really by looking at the available market, so the total available market, the serviceable available market, etc. And from that, you have an opportunity analysis. You have a sense of what it is you can capture and what it's going to take to capture that. Next slide, please, Adelia. So that really is, in a couple of key points, defining the opportunity within your capabilities, defining the opportunity based upon those partnerships or those joint venturing, which then leads to a vision, which then sets up a business model. So as you can see, these are big decisions that have to be made, but by doing the right work up front, by doing the right analysis as you move towards steps, you're basically de-risking, and you're finding out where the, if you will, the gotchas exist as you move forward. And that will also define the business model that you're going to put in place. Next slide, please, Delia. Then there is a ratio. So what is my plan? What am I going to have to do as an organization? Who are the people? What's the organization? What are my goals via a roadmap? We always think it's very important to set out timeframes and accomplishments in order to measure success and measure progress. And it also allows you to sort of stay on course and not get sidetracked. The US, as all of you know, is a huge market with a lot of complexity and a lot of opportunity. So very easy to get sort of off the road at certain points. So we think a roadmap is very, very important, and a plan to achieve that, a roadmap. Next slide, please, Delia. So really, it's the plan to fit the market and the plan to fit that opportunity that you've identified. So actually be able to lay on what the strategy is, where it hits those opportunity points, and what the evaluation is for success, or the success criteria as you move through. Then there's also timing. One of the things, and Delia touched on this in her part of the presentation, one of the things that has been happening in the US until very recently, there's been lots of promise and there's been lots of expectation, but the timing has really been somewhat nebulous. We believe that with the Vineyard Wind record of decision, with the latest announcement from Ørsted, that there actually is a time frame, and there actually is a time frame for projects that in turn has a time frame for when services and products are available. So it's very important to understand, for example, if you're working with a large tier one, say a turbine manufacturer, and you have a critical component, the process by which you get your critical component approved and part of that turbine manufacturer's supply chain can be a 2-year period. So it's really important to understand where your products and services fit within the industry itself, and then also the timing and the criteria that needs to take place for your product or service to be included in their delivery of the wind farm. And that also sets up organizational needs and locations. As Delia mentioned, there is this clustering that's taking place in the US right now. And you could look at the New York, New Jersey area. I believe that GE has already announced they're going to build a nacelle plant. That's going to set up a supply chain. So that is sort of an area that if you're in that sort of components, you should be in. Operations and maintenance are probably going to be driven out of the Northeast. Marshalling in the Mid-Atlantic, as well as some other manufacturing. So it's really important to look at location by clustering, by timing, and then that helps drive not only your organizational requirements, but also the importance of when to enter in the market, which probably the most important thing is that limits risk, right? If one understands the time frame, if one understands the opportunity, one understands the investment that has to be made, you can greatly reduce risk, you can greatly reduce time to market, and you can greatly increase the chance of success. So this is really a critical phase, and one that needs to be objective as you rationalize what your business is going to look like in the US. Next slide, please, Delia. So the implementation is a really important phase. The implementation is obviously when money does get spent. It's when organizations are started up. It's when investment in people and facilities and the readiness for the market occurs. And this is a process that really we feel is continually looked at and continually evaluated across the business life cycle. Next slide, Delia. And so actually the market readiness, we believe that during the phases I've just talked about, there's certain decisions that have to be made in order to move into the next phase. Now, these, like everything else, change, right? But you need to sort of have a firm idea about what the market is before you enter in the market. When you actually start to implement, you update the market because the market's changing. As the market begins to operate, you update this portion of your work. You look at the opportunity. You've really got to know what the opportunity is. As you begin to rationalize and you implement, that may change. You can update. But these are phases that are continually have to be done within an effective market entry strategy. Excuse me. And this really comes back to, in some sense, what we talked about earlier, which is the understanding of where the market is going, the timing and the clustering. And these factors all become part of your market entry process. And so a lot of people we tend to find look at, well, where am I going to locate? I mean, so where should my location be? Really what determines the location is the market analysis, the opportunity analysis, a plan, and a roadmap. So these are the things that all have to be looked at and all have to be evaluated as one moves forward in their market entry and market development path. And I think there's one thing that's important to talk about here, and it's what Delia mentioned earlier, is that all the states in the U.S. have economic development organizations. And these economic development organizations' sole purpose in life is to help companies locate in their areas and be successful in their areas. The states that are involved in offshore wind farms, so all the Atlantic coast states, from Massachusetts right down through North Carolina, are very interested in economic development and are very interested in carving a piece of the market for themselves. As a result, states have incentive programs, states have financial programs, states have job training programs, states have property managers that find the locations for you. I would really encourage that as you look towards the US, you look towards where you fit in the clustering through the market analysis. You identify what state or what area within a state you want to be in, is to really join forces with the economic development organizations, because they will be an access into the incentives that states offer in order to support your businesses. And I can just give, in Rhode Island as an example, if you're a firm and you're going to have an operation in Rhode Island with even as few as 10 people, the state will actually rebate each one of those employees' state income tax to the company. The state will also provide the training of employees through its community college network, through its job training programs. They will actually train people for free for you. If you want to build a building, there are very discounted financial loan products that are available. And what's interesting about these programs, as you look at them, is they can be stacked on top of each other. So you could get both the tax incentives as well as training incentives. And so I would really encourage, as you look towards an area once again, to really get involved with the EDOs, the economic development organizations that help drive your business forward. And so we wanted to leave as much time as we could for Q&A. So I'm going to wrap up now, but the message I would say here is do your research, understand your market, understand the clustering that's taking place, and talk to as many people as you possibly can, because we believe that partnerships and conversation are the way this industry is going to grow. And I would encourage you to look now, because the industry needs what you have to offer. So with that, Delia, I'll turn it back to you, and we can answer any questions that the audience has.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Yeah, so I hope everybody found that beneficial. If you've got any other questions or would like some more information other than what we discuss in the next 15 or so minutes, feel free to reach out to Jeff or I. We tried to keep it light on the industry side in the beginning, but if anybody would like to know more about, the project life cycle or contracting strategies and package delineation in the industry or anything at all, we are not to toot our own horn, but we're supply chain experts for the offshore wind industry in the United States. We've done studies in pretty much every region at this point. Okay, so with that, I guess we'll turn it over to questions.
Great, thanks so much, Delia and Jeff. For all attendees, feel free to type in the Q&A and we will monitor those, and I'll try to facilitate some of that Q&A. We have one that just came in, and so I'll just read it to both of you and see if you guys can provide some insight. So the question is, what is the predominant type of floating hull and mooring system? Do they weather vane like FPSO, so floating production and offloading systems? You guys could probably see it too, but I thought I'd read it out for everybody.
I do see it there.
I can't answer that, but I could find some. That's above my technical prowess. But I will certainly, if you could forward me that, I will certainly answer that. I will certainly get that person in contact with someone who.
Yeah, I think my quick answer.
Can't answer that.
I think my quick answer for that would be it really depends on a lot of conditions. Floating is a fairly emergent technology, even in the more established offshore wind regions. So it really depends on the actual water depth, on the seabed conditions, the climate conditions in the region. And there are many different types of floating foundations. Well, I think there's 4 standard types, but then within that, there's a lot of nuances as well. So if you'd like to, provide us with your email address or get in touch with one of us, we can certainly provide a little bit more information on that from our technical colleagues that are much more experienced.
Another one that I had actually, as you were talking, Jeff, and I was just thinking about what we've been going through, also trying to work with Aaron on just trying to do any kind of work in the US during travel restrictions, and
Right.
And which is why we're all here in this webinar today, right? So
Right.
one thing that you pointed out a few times is, it's how important it is to create a network and to be there. And that's obviously like one of the things I think for a lot of our members and companies probably attending that's been pretty challenging. Things are changing rapidly, right? So we know that travel is going to pick up again, but I'm just wondering if you have any insight on strategies around that, like when you can't be there in person, what should a company be doing?
Well, I think these are great. These are great opportunities in what you've done here right now. There are also the Business Network for Offshore Wind, as well as an organization that used to be called AWEA, but is now called American Clean Power. They have virtual meetings. It's good to be part of those. I would also encourage, there is the IPF in-person conference, which is going to be in late August. Hopefully we'll all be able to travel by then. Indications are that that's probably going to take place. That would be a good forum to be in. There's also the American Clean Power Conference taking place in Boston in mid-October. I think it's October 13th to 15th, although don't quote me on that. So there are events in which are out there. They are virtual now, but hopefully we can meet face to face, but just be part of those virtual networks. And we'd be glad to send Aaron and send you and Amanda a list of some of those organizations that you could then pass out to your membership and get them access that way.
Yeah, no, that is great. And I would also mention that we have an MOU with the US Business Network for Offshore Wind.
Oh, good. Okay.
Working with them a bit too, and kind of coming up with some strategies and things that we can do and collaborate for the benefit of both memberships.
Yes.
So I think there's some opportunities there. Obviously, COVID has made these things challenging, but now we're better at this too. So that's the positive. Right. So another question just came up. So the question is, what extent of in-water monitoring of currents, waves, and water quality is required prior to, during, and following construction? i.e. during operations?
That's an interesting question because the one unique aspect of the US industry is that the wind farms are in federal waters, but they are bought by states. And so really that's a permitting question. And there are multiple stakeholders that are involved in that. It varies by state. There are, however, EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, that does have requirements regarding those elements during the construction phase. And I would suggest that the EPA is a good place to look. Water quality and waves and water quality? Don't know specific about the water quality aspect, but I could certainly find out. If you could get me Matthew's email address, I'll find out. There are also periodic studies that are taking place on the health of the environment around the wind farms after construction. One was just completed on Block Island last year, where they looked at fish stocks, they looked at crustaceans, they looked at the effect upon currents, meaning is it affecting the seabed around the foundations, et cetera. So those are ongoing activities.
I think all types of subsea monitoring are really front of mind and being very well utilized in the industry. You know, things like AUVs and then ongoing monitoring with sensor arrays and that type of thing. It's critical for the ongoing operations, and then also for future planning for you know, as technology develops and that type of thing. So I mean, one of the reasons that the Gulf of Mexico hasn't been developed yet, and there are a few reasons, but one of the primary reasons is that it's a hurricane zone. So as the technology evolves, it's going to need to be able to withstand hurricane conditions. And I know environmental monitoring of all types is very key in assisting with the ongoing development of those technologies. And Jeff mentioned the EPA. I'd also like to say that BOEM, the Bureau of Offshore Energy Management in the Department of the Interior, is also a really great resource and are heavily involved with the development of the industry, specifically with permitting oversight.
Just to jump in on the state level, particularly because it relates to some of these in-water measurements, Mass Clean Energy Center had been involved in a number of projects related to Met Ocean data. And I think you'll find some examples of the types of measurements and data they were collecting in advance of the Vineyard Wind Farm. So that might be helpful as well.
For sure.
And obviously wave height is sort of interesting. One aspect of wave height that's interesting is when you were shipping crews out and back from the wind farm, either during construction or during its actual operation for operations and maintenance, you know, they want crews to arrive not seasick. And so they actually do studies of looking at waves during certain times of the year and when best to schedule some operations and maintenance activities.
Okay, interesting. We have one more that just came in. So this kind of goes back to, you know, doing business in the US if you're coming from another country. So what are you seeing for visa requirements and processing times? That's one part. And then just a comment, we have personnel moving globally and it has been a nightmare, plus all of the other changing requirements.
You know, I'll ask Delia because she just went through the visa process. She's better than me at that.
So as a Canadian individual, the visa process for working in the United States is actually fairly straightforward and quite quick. I basically just had to, it's under the NAFTA agreement, the specific type of visa that I'm working under. I basically just had to present some documentation at the border and have a letter from my employer, Xodus, with some specific data within it, so timelines and salary, and then specific requirements. For companies, I mean, it wouldn't be a visa necessarily, but I'm not sure necessarily what would be involved with that. Or for foreign nationals other than Canadians coming in, it is a little bit more complicated. Specifically right now, I know from colleagues from the UK that have recently moved over that it is a much more involved process, but it's still happening, and I think a lot of the timelines are starting to accelerate again. But you know, as in any of these cases, it shouldn't be a big roadblock. If you are a Canadian individual, there's lots of provisions in the existing frameworks between the United States and Canada. And if you're abroad, I mean, I just would recommend hiring an immigration lawyer to accelerate the process, because it does really save a lot of time.
Great, thanks, Delia. And I would say I actually experienced the NAFTA process on the flip side of it, so coming into Canada, and it was very quick and easy. So if there is an ability for people to do that, I would say check it out, because it is streamlined for sure.
Mm-hmm.
On that, oh, actually, hang on, there's one more question, then I had a follow-up kind of, but I'll go to this one first. What is your view on feeder barge and related concepts versus US built WTIVs? How will that develop over the coming years?
That's a great question.
That's a great question.
You know, because one of the things, you know, the Jones Act, which you all know very well from the first one, is sort of an impediment to growth in the U.S. offshore wind industry. What people tend to look at is people tend to look at big vessels like CTVs and SOVs and those kinds of things. There's actually not enough barges in the U.S. right now. So there is a need for barges to be built. And we feel that's going to take two forms. One is upgrading existing barges to make them wider in order so more pieces can be loaded out to the site. There's also going to be new construction. We see that happening in a couple of areas. One is in the Gulf of Mexico. One has to remember that most of the vessels that support the nation's offshore oil industry are in the Gulf. They have a lot of those vessels. The others is the other area is the Hampton Roads area, which is a big naval shipyard. So there's lots of shipyard capability there. So that is in planning now, are the vessels. Right now, for example, there's only a single jackup vessel that's being built by Dominion currently, and it's being built in the Gulf. So vessel retooling, barge building, barge refitting is something that's getting a lot more interest right now. How to also retool some of the offshore oil vessels in order to support offshore wind. So if that's an industry that some of the companies are interested in, I think there is a highly receptive audience here, because we just don't have the vessels necessary.
Yeah, just to agree with Jeff there, I mean, the project pipeline right now and the development timelines are such that, you know, there's already a shortage, but as we go forward, it's going to become a lot more critical and start having an impact on project timelines. So that's a huge focus here, and there's definitely a big opportunity for Canadian shipping companies to fill the gap,
Absolutely.
especially with feeder barge type operations.
Absolutely, absolutely.
One more just to have here is around, you mentioned, Jeff, the state programs, economic development organizations.
Mm-hmm.
Aaron, you might have some insight on this piece as well. One thing I'm wondering is, you know, we hear a lot in Canada about local content and that being kind of potentially one of the barriers to working in the US. And I'm just curious, and you may not know the answer to this, but I'm just wondering, with some of these incentive programs and supports the state agencies provide, or the economic development organizations, whether the local content piece is a consideration, or they kind of focus more on providing these incentives for investment attraction, like getting firms to set up shop in the US.
That's a great question. Local content and investment attraction are sort of two separate things. Excuse me. So the state EDOs are looking at economic development. Contracts, meaning the purchase agreements between the owner operator and the state, is where local content, takes place. Local content varies contract to contract. In certain states, I'll use Maryland as an example, the local content is very specific. There's X amount of jobs, you have to use X labor force. I believe there's even that X% of the CapEx has to go through the Port of Baltimore. You have other states like, in Rhode Island, a neighboring state that just says, do your best. We want to see your contributions. We're not going to tell you what it will be. There is, however, a trend that I think is important to sort of discuss here, which is the power purchase agreements or the RFPs from the states that are going out to the developers to purchase power are shifting the percentage of evaluation, right? So they have criteria within the RFPs that says this is how your bid will be graded. And for example, the most recent one from Massachusetts, 70% of the bid is quantitative, which is your price per kilowatt. The second part of it, which is 30%, is qualitative. And that's where local content comes in, but it gets kind of specific. It's not just local content, it's also a diversity and inclusion. It's environmental equity. So it's factors that go beyond just how many jobs. It's where are you going to find those people, and what sort of equity are you going to put within the hiring and the economic development process. And what I think is important, and this is why another element that circles back to why we have to build an industry here, most PPAs will say your price per kilowatt can't be higher than what's previously been purchased. And so the only way the developers and the OEMs and the developers, OEMs, and tier ones can achieve those price goals is sort of by scale. So they want local content across a region. And an example of that is there's an MOU, a memorandum of understanding between North Carolina, Virginia, and Maryland, which says that they're going to help spread local content across those 3 states, regardless where the power is being purchased from. So states are actually banding together in order to sort of normalize, if you will, local content across a region versus just by contract.
Maybe I'll jump in really briefly here because we actually did a program back in March with the economic development agencies from Massachusetts and Rhode Island. They're definitely interested in investment attraction. I mean, there's no doubt there are incentives if you are considering setting up shop somewhere in the US, they want to do. But they also recognize they have supply chain gaps. This is a nascent industry. They need to fill these gaps. So they were, quite clear in saying, they welcome Canadian companies to register for their supply chain directories. So Massachusetts has one. I believe Rhode Island has one as well. They are, occasionally looking at partnering, particularly if they have a local company that is missing a key piece that maybe Canadian companies can supply. And that's something that they are looking at internally.
Yes.
So yes, one of their main goals is investment attraction, but I would not say that precludes companies, particularly if you're looking for local partners, from speaking with them because they're actively interested in that as well.
Yes, absolutely, Aaron. I see there's a question about PPA and where are they now? I can tell you that in 2015, South Fork, the PPA was 16.3 cents. The most recent one, which was from Mayflower Wind, was 5.8 cents. So the price per kilowatt is definitely going down. We have a chart that we could send you that actually shows you sort of the current PPA pricing. But what's important to understand, this gets back to Elisa's comment about, or the question about local content. When Mayflower submitted its bid, it submitted 3. It said, here's with a lot of local content, here's with some local content, and here's just the cheapest price. And Massachusetts picked the cheapest price. So there is there is a consciousness about the ratepayer. These contracts typically last 25 to 30 years. Is what the agreement is.
Great. So I think we are at time. One thing I was going to ask you both, Jeff and Delia, I can't remember if your email address was on the PowerPoint. I'm not sure. But when we send everything out, we can send if you're okay with it, we'll send the email addresses out too. So if people have questions, they can just.
Absolutely, please do.
Sure. Yes, I don't
Please
believe
do.
it is in the presentation, so please distribute that.
Okay, no, that sounds great. And so for everybody participating, we will be sending out a recording of this. So you'll have access to it. If you missed some parts or you need to hear it again, we will be sending that after the webinar. And I just want to thank both Delia and Jeff for a very thoughtful and interesting presentation. I think it was very helpful. Obviously spurred a lot of questions and comments from everyone on the webinar. And thank you again, Erin, for joining us and working with us on this. We're looking forward to doing some other ones, and for everybody participating, just keep on the lookout. We are going to be developing more webinars. We have more activities planned, and we really just look forward to working with all of you. And I'll also say, if you have ideas on things that Marine Renewables Canada could help you with, or activities we could run, let us know, because I'm sure we can bounce ideas off Erin as well and try to collaborate more on this. So thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks so
it was a
much.
pleasure.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.